This video is going to describe Virchow's triad, or the elements that a patient might have that puts them at risk of developing a blood clot, a thrombosis, a clot in an intact vessel. So normally, a blood vessel does not develop a clot for two main reasons. One, it has healthy endothelial cells, which release mediators into the blood, specifically nitric oxide and prostacyclin, which keeps this vessel dilated, so it's nice and open and there's room for the blood to flow through. And nitric oxide prevents platelet activation. So we know that a platelet could become activated and that would release mediators that activate additional platelets, which means we could accidentally get platelet aggregation, which we don't want in a normal intact vessel. Nitric oxide prevents that. The second reason we don't get a blood clot in an intact vessel is that when you have normal blood flow through a vessel, all of the cells stay in this central column with laminar flow. They're not interacting with each other. They're really heading in just straight lines, and we're constantly washing out the blood in any given area. So with the laminar flow, there's less chance that cells can bump into each other. And specifically thinking about those clotting factors that float around in our blood in the inactive form, if they bump into each other, they could accidentally activate one of the clotting factors, which could trigger the domino effect of the coagulation cascade. If we're constantly washing those factors out, if one accidentally gets activated, it doesn't necessarily lead to a full-blown coagulation cascade. So the first point of Virchow's is stasis or abnormal blood flow. Stasis means stoppage or slowing of blood flow. And if blood isn't moving quickly through a vessel, it will become abnormal in that it won't maintain laminar flow. So stasis or abnormal flow increases your risk because instead of going in those straight lines, the cells and the coagulation factors become turbulent, they can bump into each other, and they can accidentally activate coagulation factors. So the risk here is that clotting factors get activated. And because because this is a positive feedback loop, if you activate this pathway and you get a little thrombin will activate the intrinsic pathway and it will continue to generate fibrin. Any condition in the body that slows down, stops blood flow, or creates abnormal flow can increase your risk of developing a clot. When you have the ability or the environment where clotting factors can get activated, stasis can lead to an area of local hypercoagulability. So there's an interaction between the points of Virchow's where when you have stasis, you increase the likelihood of hypercoagulability in an area in the blood. Similarly, if you have abnormal blood flow and you have turbulent cells banging into the walls, you can develop endothelial dysfunction in that area. So due to the turbulence, the cells of the blood banging into the endothelial cells, they actually can damage those cells and create an endothelial injury where the cells are not producing nitric oxide normally. So in this way, your initial risk factor was stasis, but stasis can lead to a local hypercoagulability, which increases the risk. There's also the possibility that stasis and abnormal blood flow can damage endothelial cells, leading to endothelial injury. Another point on the triad is endothelial dysfunction as a standalone risk factor. There might be a reason why your endothelial cells are no longer healthy and they're not producing sufficient amounts of nitric oxide. In the case of endothelial dysfunction, the cells are intact, but they're not doing their job well, and they're not releasing the mediators that are necessary to keep this blood vessel healthy. So endothelial dysfunction is really the hallmark of this is that loss of nitric oxide, loss of NO, nitric oxide. Without nitric oxide, we lose that vasodilator influence, so the vessel is going to be more constricted, more likely to lead to reduced blood flow in that area. But without nitric oxide, this leaves us vulnerable to platelet activation. Platelet activation, we know, is its own positive feedback loop because an activated platelet can activate other platelets. So all we need is a little bit to get started, and suddenly we have a bunch of activated platelets hanging around and grabbing on to fibrinogen as it floats by, and we're developing the cellular base of a blood clot. Just like how stasis can influence the other points of Virchow's, endothelial dysfunction can lead to an area of local hypercoagulability, increasing the likelihood that you can form a blood clot in an area that has endothelial dysfunction. And endothelial dysfunction can actually lead to stasis and abnormal blood flow. We see this largely through the action of vasoconstriction when we lose that vasodilator influence of nitric oxide. So there might have been a cause in your blood vessel that led to injury of your endothelial cells. Without your endothelial cells making nitric oxide, there's a greater vasoconstrictor influence of that blood vessel, leading to abnormal blood flow or even stasis if it's very small. The final corner, hypercoagulability, can be a standalone risk factor. There are a whole host of genetic conditions that can increase the likelihood of you forming a blood clot. The most prevalent is called factor V Leiden. There are other systemic things that can increase the blood's coagulability, and by that I mean the blood's likelihood of forming a clot. We know that estrogen-containing oral contraceptives increase the coagulability. A really, really big one is cancer. Cancer increases the coagulability of the blood. So where stasis and endothelial dysfunction can cause the other points of Virchow's triad, hypercoagulability is a standalone risk factor that doesn't necessarily then feed back and cause either stasis or endothelial dysfunction. By looking at the cause of someone's blood clot, it can make sense what type of clot might form in different areas of the body. When your risk factor is stasis or abnormal flow, the instigator of your clot is that your clotting factors get activated, which means it's the coagulation cascade is what is getting turned on erroneously. The final product of the coagulation cascade is fibrin. So in the case of a blood clot that starts from stasis or abnormal blood flow, the blood just starts forming a ton of fibrin in the area, and it catches the cells as they float by. So in this case, you would expect the blood clot to be what we call a red blood clot. Red because it's full of red blood cells, because the main product of the clot is the fibrin. It's the fibrin that you made by accident by turning on the coagulation cascade. In our anatomy, the location where we're more likely to have slow-moving blood is the venous system. So when blood clots form in the venous system, they are usually red. So these are usually our venous thrombus. For this reason, when someone is at risk of developing a venous clot, they would be put on an anticoagulant because they're trying to block the clotting factors from getting activated in this patient that has a risk. On the other side, the endothelial dysfunction, when the main cause of your clot is platelet activation, we have what's called a white blood clot. It is white because the main cell type within this clot is platelets. It's full of platelets because the clot started through platelet activation. So we ended up actually getting a platelet plug in an intact vessel, which then ultimately got tied down and created the blood clot. Since this type of clot is caused by endothelial dysfunction, when we look at the anatomy of our blood vessels, our arterial side is at a much greater risk of damaging the endothelial cells because that is the blood vessel that is under high pressure. The exposure to high pressure increases the likelihood that you could get endothelial injury, which is why white blood clots are more often found in the arterial side. If a patient is at risk of developing an arterial clot, they would most likely be put on an antiplatelet. The goal being that the drug can stop this initiating step of platelet activation.